right, well, thank you for coming out today. It's my honor and pleasure to introduce Dr. Andrew Hartman. Dr. Hartman is Associate Professor of History at Illinois State University, and he is a former distinguished Fulbright Chair. Where were you at?
Denmark.
Denmark.
Yeah.
Yep, so he's at Denmark. He is a past president of the Society for U.S. Intellectual History. He's a blogger there now. He's also their conference organizer for this upcoming year. So a very busy guy. He'll be talking today about his second book, A War for the Soul of America, A History of the Culture Wars. And so you might have encountered the culture wars through issues like abortion and gay marriage. But as Dr. Hartman will tell us, there was a lot more involved with the culture wars. So there'll be plenty to talk about afterwards. So write down your questions. Dr. Hartman.
Thank you. All right, thanks for coming out. And I'll just, if any of you are getting extra credit for being here, just don't tell me. Because, I'm just going to pretend like it's the blind date and you want to be here. This is what you'd rather be doing than anything else. But I'm excited to be here, and especially thankful to Dr. Edwards for inviting me and making this happen. So, as you can see by my shiny pastel-colored book cover, I think they were going with like a Miami Vice look or something, which would be funny if you had grown up in the 80s. You know what Miami Vice is? Maybe, maybe not. So my talk today will be just sort of to give you an introduction to the culture wars, a history of the culture wars based upon my book and what I argue in the book. So this is the title of my book, A War for the Soul of America. When the conservative, let's see if this is working, yes. When the conservative Patrick Buchanan declared a war for the soul of America during his rowdy primetime speech before the 1992 Republican National Convention in Houston, he restated a theme that had animated his campaign during the Republican primaries of that year against, it was sort of an underdog campaign against then President George H.W. Bush. This theme was the culture wars. It was a struggle, in Buchanan's words, as critical to the nation we will one day be as was the Cold War itself. So his rhetoric was urgent, and by making his rhetoric so urgent, what he was trying to do was to elevate the stakes of that year's presidential election. More than a clash between Bush and the Democratic challenger, Bill Clinton, the nation was confronted by a decision about who we are, what we believe, about whether, quote, the Judeo-Christian values and beliefs upon which this nation was built would survive. So this became a notorious speech, and pundits still talk about it. It punctuated a series of angry battles that had dominated headlines during the 1980s and then continued to dominate headlines during the 1990s. These are the debates that became known as the culture wars. And the list of divisive culture wars issues is long. I'll just list a few that I deal with in the book. Abortion, affirmative action, art and censorship of art, evolution, family values, feminism, homosexuality, intelligence testing, media sort of debates about the media, multiculturalism, national history standards, pornography, school prayer, sex education, the Western canon, or the sort of great books of Western civilization that all Americans were supposed to read. These are all of the issues sort of taken as a whole that became known as the culture wars. And I think if you think about all of these issues, then it's pretty clear that the nation, the United States, was sort of beset by culture wars, or Buchanan's War for the Soul of America was definitely on. The issues at stake in the culture wars, I argue in the book, were real and compelling. Such a straightforward notion defies a much more conventional argument that's been made most recently by Thomas Frank in his best-selling book, What's the Matter with Kansas? In this book, Frank argues that the culture wars were superficial and helped make our national politics irrational. For example, he relates the controversy over the artist Andres Serrano's blasphemous piece of art called Piss Christ. Maybe some of you have seen this before. It's a photo, the art is a photo of an image. It's a photo of a crucifix that's dunked in a jar of the artist's own urine. So, it's pretty controversial. It's pretty offensive to many people. So, the fact that so many people got worked up about this to Thomas Frank was sort of a notion of how the culture wars gets the goods for conservatives. Quote, and here's Thomas Frank, because some artist decides to shock the Hicks by dunking Jesus in urine, the entire planet must remake itself along the lines preferred by the Republican Party USA. So just to sort of put in my own words, Thomas Frank's argument, religious conservatives, he thought, often voted against their own economic interests due to their obsession with the culture wars. Republican politicians then, sort of in cynical fashion, lent rhetorical support to the culture wars as they focused on more important matters. More important matters to them would have been like rewriting the tax codes in favor of the rich. So Frank, who was a liberal and who grew up in Kansas, was dismayed by these developments in his home state and in the larger nation. His fellow Kansans, his fellow Americans, were defying his populist expectations that they direct their anger at the wealthy. He wanted them to direct their anger at those responsible for making their economic lives so precarious, which is perhaps fine insofar as it goes, but by that logic, debates about the idea of the idea of what it means to be an American are mere sideshows. For Thomas Frank, that was all bread and circuses. So my argument is different. The history of America, for better or worse, is largely a history of debates about the idea of America. Ever since the nation's founding, Americans have wrestled with Crèvecoeur's famous riddle, what then is this American, this new man? Disputes over this question have served as the battleground of American cultural conflict since the nation's founding. And such disputes intensified during times of tumultuous change and sort of national cultural conflict. The unique period in American history known as the 60s and the turbulent decades that followed the 60s were just such times of tumult. The 60s gave birth to a new America, a nation more open to new peoples, new ideas, new norms, and new, if conflicting, articulations of the very idea of America itself. This fact, more than anything else, helps explain why after the 60s, the national culture grew more divided than any period since perhaps the Civil War. Americans split over how to think about this new America. The gulf that separated those who embraced the new America from those who viewed it darkly, this gulf between those who looked to nurture this new America from those who thought to roll back this new America, this is the sort of this chasm that drew the boundaries of the culture wars. The sociologist James Davidson Hunter put it like this in his important 1991 book just titled The Culture Wars. Our most fundamental ideas about who we are as Americans is now at odds. So the history of this culture wars, which are often misremembered as one angry shouting match after another, offer us insight into the genuine political transformation or cultural transformation that happened during the 60s. This, in a nutshell, is the larger argument of my book, that the 60s were a cultural revolution and that the culture wars are the legacy of that revolution. That said, to say as much is not to say that these transformations during the 60s emerged new or whole cloth. So in other words, I'm making a pretty strong claim about the 60s that there was this cultural revolution that was new and different. But I'm not saying that a lot of the sort of sensibilities that push these movements forward were new. So let me give you a few examples. The 60s counterculture the ethics of sex, drugs, and rock and roll, grew out of earlier cultural sensibilities of the Beats. Their critics called them the Beatniks. Those like Allen Ginsberg and Jack Kerouac, who are both pictured here. They brought bohemia to the masses with their unconventional poems and books and ways of living. New left groups such as Students for a Democratic Society, which was the largest anti-war group during the 1960s, they were sustained by the earlier political sensibilities of leftist intellectuals, those like C. Wright Mills, who's pictured here, looking pretty cool and intellectual, Paul Goodman, William Appleman Williams, there are others. In short, these intellectuals had radical visions for America that transcended Cold War conformism during the 1950s. And so the student radicals in the 60s weren't entirely new, but the fact that there were so many of them was definitely new. Similarly, in the 1960s, there were a lot of conservatives. Many conservatives, for example, in California, supported the violent police crackdowns on student protesters at University of California, Berkeley. Governor Ronald Reagan, who ordered these crackdowns, called Berkeley a haven for sex deviants. And he once said that the only thing that they needed was a good whipping. So that was new to the 60s, seemingly, but these conservatives emerged from this sort of conservative ideas emerged from the earlier cultural sensibilities of those many Americans who were angered by Elvis Presley's pelvic gyrations on the Ed Sullivan Show. So a lot of this wasn't new necessarily. New right organizations like Young Americans for Freedom, which grew in the 1960s and is still around, were nourished by the earlier sort of political ideas of intellectuals like William F. Buckley Jr. Buckley offered a withering critique of secularist and collectivist professors in his famous 1950 book, God and Man at Yale. These ideas gave life to a powerful conservative imagination that had supposedly been rendered obsolete by the modern world, by modernity. So in addition to these instances of political turmoil, there were other massive changes during the 1960s that gave life to the culture wars. One that I really focus on is the sort of demise of intellectual authority, intellectual traditions. So what do I mean by this? Let me put this another way by asking a question. How do we know what is true? It's a tough question. Maybe you've taken some sort of philosophy class or theology class in which that question has been asked. For many Americans, prior to the 1960s, that question was easily answered, and the answer usually had something to do with God, family, country, and maybe Western civilization. After the 60s, there was no longer any consensus about how to answer that question. There was only confusion or division. So that seemed rather new, but as with the political changes of the 60s, these intellectual transformations were not necessarily new. So, for example, the so-called postmodern condition, this idea or this realization that all that is solid melts into the air, that nothing seems real anymore. This has been liberating to some, frightening to others, but these ideas had long ago shaken the foundations of American thought. The French philosopher Michel Foucault, who was the most widely read theorist in the American humanities since the 1960s, especially in English and American and cultural studies, he was thought to have revolutionized American intellectual life with statements about truth, power, and knowledge. For example, Foucault famously said that knowledge is not made for understanding, knowledge is made for cutting. In other words, knowledge is about power, it's not about truth. Lynn Cheney, many of you might know her more famously as the wife of our former Vice President, Dick Cheney, but she was extremely famous on her own merits. Earlier, in fact, from 1986 to 1983, she was chair of the National Endowment for the Humanities, and thus was an avid culture warrior. she argued that Foucault's ideas were nothing less than an assault on Western civilization. And in fact, she called the Clinton presidency the postmodern presidency because it seemed so detached from the truth. And so in a way, she was sort of blaming Foucault for the Clinton administration. So she thinks this is new and she's blaming Foucault. But by the time Cheney had made this charge, it had been nearly a century since the American philosopher William James had made the claim that the truth is only the expedient in the way of our thinking, just as the right is only the expedient in our way of behaving. In other words, abstract concepts like truth, justice, I guess the American way if we're talking about Superman. These concepts have long been considered particular to time, place, and perspective. So a lot of this stuff wasn't new. More on this point about how relativism predated the 60s. In the 1940s, university students across the country, especially at elite institutions like Harvard, were assigned to read the American anthropologist Margaret Mead, pictured here. Margaret Mead, according to the historian David Hollinger, explicitly and relentlessly questioned the certainties of home culture, of American culture, by juxtaposing them with often romanticized images of distant communities of humans. So this is a cultural relativism that Americans were reading at universities across the country as early as the 1940s. Her idea that American students are becoming familiar with is that much of what we call as natural, what seems natural, was in fact cultural or specific to culture. This was an indication, perhaps, that American political culture, or at least sort of intellectual culture, had fractured before the 60s, because Americans already didn't have any one set standard answer to the question, how do we know when something is true? What is truth? So perhaps this age of fracture, this is a label that has been recently made famous by the historian Dan Rogers in his book by that title, to describe the era since the 1960s. Perhaps it was nothing new. So I've just spent like 5 or 10 minutes telling you it was nothing new, and now I'm going to say, actually, it was new. So I argue in my book that the idea that fracture predated the 60s is an overstatement. Because I argue in the book that the 60s universalized fracture. How so? So prior to the 60s, most Americans, or many Americans, particularly white middle-class Americans, like me and my family, like many of you, were largely sheltered from the sort of postmodern notions, the acids of modernity, as they were called. Modern ways of thinking that seemingly subjected timeless truths, including truths about America, to this lens of suspicion. Put another way, or prior to the 1960s, many Americans did not yet realize that their sacred cows, the things we held most, the things we cherished most, that they were being butchered by people like William James. Many Americans only felt the vertigo of their worlds coming apart once they experienced chaos as a political force or a movement of peoples previously excluded from the American mainstream. The radical political mobilizations of the 60s, the civil rights movement, the Black and Chicano power movements, feminism, gay liberation, the anti-war movement, the legal push for secularization. These are the movements that destabilized the America that millions thought they knew. It was only after the 60s that many Americans, particularly conservatives, recognized that there was a threat to their once great nation. So after the 60s, during the culture wars, this period I call the culture wars, whether one thought the nation was in moral decline was often very much related to whether one was liberal or conservative. The political scientist Joseph Epstein called the 60s something of a political Rorschach test. Tell me what you think of that period and I shall tell you what your politics are. Maybe this still persists. Those who argue that the 60s had ushered in sort of anarchy, ethical anarchy, chaos, and that such confusion threatened the very fabric of the nation, they tended to be conservative. For instance, the conservative historian Gertrude Himmelfarb, who wrote, "The beasts of modernism have mutated into the beasts of postmodernism, amorality into immorality, irrationality into insanity, sexual deviancy into polymorphous perversity." Nice Freudian term there for you. So obviously she thought things had gone from bad to worse. She was never, I guess, that much of a fan of modernism to begin with. But this right-wing declension narrative, this notion that things are getting worse and worse and worse, it advanced a theory of historical change in America that no matter how hyperbolic it was, or no matter what you might think of its value judgments, was more or less accurate. An older America had been lost, and so this is where I argue the conservatives got the 60s right. This doesn't mean that we should or have to agree with them that the 1950s were better. It only means that things did indeed change. They were right about that. Things did fall apart. How did I skip so far ahead? Oh, well. In the post-war years, the nearly 2 decades between the end of World War II and the assassination of John F. Kennedy, a cluster of powerful norms set the parameters of American culture. These cultural standards are best described by what I call normative America. This is an analytical category I use to refer to a group of assumptions and aspirations shared by millions of Americans during the post-war years, or during the 50s. Normative Americans prized hard work, personal responsibility, individual merit, delayed gratification, social mobility, and other values that middle-class whites recognized as their own. So I'm just going to grab something real quickly here because I hadn't updated my slides, and there are some images I really wanted you to see. So 1 second, thinking on the fly. Now I'm not going to sign off on that YouTube thing. Come on. Slow, slow, slow. I had these cool Norman Rockwell paintings that I just forgot to. There we go. Okay. To me, this is like representative of what I'm calling this 1950s normative America. The images really sort of make my whole argument, so I had to take a little time there. So these normative Americans lived according to these basic sort of stringent expectations, especially about things like sex. Sex, whether it was for procreation or recreation, was expected to be confined to heterosexual marriage. Normative Americans were expected to behave consistent with strict gender roles. Within the confines of marriage, men went to work, women stayed home and raised children. Normative Americans believed their nation was the best in human history. Those aspects of American history that shined an unfavorable light on it, for example, slavery, were ignored or explained away as just sort of, yeah, that doesn't really say much about our history, it's an aberrance. Normative Americans often assumed that the nation's Christian heritage demonstrated its unique character. The United States of America really was a city on a hill. So this sort of cultural conformity was more pervasive during the 1950s than before or since. During the 1950s, an unprecedented number of Americans got in line, or at least they aspired to. And so particularly white heterosexual Christian Americans, which might have been close to the majority of Americans at that time in the 1950s. Even those who were barred from what I call normative America by virtue of race, sexuality, or religion often felt sort of compelled to demonstrate compliance. In part, such an extraordinary degree of conformity had a lot to do with the Cold War. A global struggle against an alien system required sort of cultural stability, ideological stability. But even more, this cohesiveness was a byproduct of the sort of internal threats to it. Some of these threats I've already talked about that were made manifest or made concrete during the 1960s. It's as if people knew the 60s were coming and that they had to sort of get together and protect against it. It's as if they knew this cultural stability was a house of cards. So the new America given life by the 60s was more pluralistic, more secular, more feminist. And it was built on the ruins of this normative America. So it's this basic historical fact that explains the flood of complaints that came out during the 1970s about a once great nation that was no longer great. President Richard Nixon expressed such an idea in his second inaugural address in January 1973. Quote, "Above all else, the time has come for us to renew our faith in ourselves and in America. In recent years, that faith has been challenged. Our children have been taught to be ashamed of their country, ashamed of their parents, ashamed of America's record at home and its role in the world. At every point, we have been beset by those who find everything wrong with America and little that is right." So for Nixon, American renewal meant forgetting the 60s, when Americans quit loving their country unconditionally. Another very prominent conservative politician who's made similar such complaints is Newt Gingrich, who was Republican Speaker of the House from 1994 until 1998. In fact, he wrote an entire book with the very appropriate title of To Renew America on a similar proposition as the one Nixon had made. From the arrival of English-speaking colonists in 1607 until 1965, from the Jamestown colony and the Pilgrims through Tocqueville's Democracy in America, up to Norman Rockwell's paintings of the 40s and 50s, and there's another classic for you, there was one continuous civilization built around commonly accepted legal and cultural principles. So for conservatives like Nixon and Gingrich, the America they loved was in distress. Returning to the values of the 50s was the only way to save it. And so I think this Rockwell painting is indicative. It's called The Runaway. So as you can see, running away from home at that time was no more sort of distressful or traumatic than having a root beer float at the local, soda shop with the nice, friendly police officer. So those on the left, in contrast to conservatives like Nixon and Gingrich, they tended to view America and American life through the eyes of the 60s. So those on the left have viewed America through the eyes of feminists and racial minorities and gays and lesbians and secularists and others whose very existence symbolized the challenge to this 1950s America. For them, American culture had always been fractured because they had never been invited to be sort of in the inner circle. Conservatives, on the other hand, have viewed American culture as something that was once whole but had been lost. Their worlds were shattered. And so you're starting to see these tensions building up that seem very existential to people, which is why the culture wars took on so much meaning to so many people. Why they were, I would argue, real, and why I think Thomas Frank is very dismissive in just saying these were just, these are irrational and there's no meaning there. The culture wars were battles over what constituted art and over whether the federal government should subsidize art that insulted the most cherished beliefs of millions of Americans. They were debates about sort of transgressive film and television shows, over whether insensitive cultural programming should be censored. fights over curriculum at the university and public school level, fights over whether or not children should be taught evolutionary biology. You know, this list goes on, but it always sort of boils down to this basic divide that came from the 60s that I was talking about. And so a lot of these culture wars happened in those places where those on the left have been very successful, in institutions like museums and universities and public schools and Hollywood. And so conservatives fought back with a sort of determination that was matched by their belief, as Patrick Buchanan said, that the culture, the power for it, the struggle for it, is the Ho Chi Minh Trail to power. So a lot of conservatives like Buchanan thought that they were going to lose their nation if they lost the sort of cultural institutions. It wasn't enough that Reagan was in the White House and the Bushes. It wasn't enough that economics had gone more the way of conservative doctrine and idea. They had to control the culture or the nation was lost. So that's sort of this period of the culture wars is what my book's trying to make sense of. So now let me give you, in another 10 or 15 minutes, and then I'll open it up to questions, a specific case study of the culture wars. And that is, I want to talk about the 1987 battle over President Reagan's nomination of Robert Bork to the Supreme Court. Early in his career, Robert Bork made a name for himself as a professor at Yale Law School. In that capacity, he helped shape how conservatives thought about the Supreme Court and how conservatives thought about American sort of jurisprudence, the legal system more generally. For instance, he was one of the first to make the case for judicial restraint, the argument that judges needed to be more restrained and not be as eager to make actual legal changes as they seem to be. He rejected the Warren Court's decision-making philosophy of ruling, quote, not according to the criteria they cite, but according to their social and political sympathies. So the Warren Court, this is the court led by Chief Justice Earl Warren that was through much of the 50s and 60s, was responsible for such landmark cases as Brown versus the Board of Education, which of course desegregated the schools and other places of American life, and Miranda versus Arizona, which gave rights to the accused, people accused of crimes. Bork's critique of the Warren Court led him to embrace the doctrine of originalism. This is this legal doctrine that you might hear a lot more about nowadays, that is premised on the idea that legal interpretation should be constrained by the original intent of those who framed the Constitution. In other words, we know what the sort of founders of the nation put on paper, and we shouldn't interpret the laws beyond that. Only original intent, he argued, can give us a law that is something other than and superior to the judge's will. This is how you had sort of objective jurisprudence according to Bork. He contended that, in fact, this originalist idea was a more democratic judicial philosophy than that which informed liberal activism of the Warren Court, and then later the Burger Court, which ruled on Roe v. Wade, of course, which legalized abortion in the first trimester of a woman's pregnancy and became a lightning rod in the culture wars. Here's how Bork argued that originalism was more democratic than the Warren and Burger courts. Because originalism confines judges to areas that the founding fathers assigned to them and reserves to democratic processes those areas to life the framers placed there. So in other words, take Roe v. Wade and abortion. The Supreme Court had no sort of ground, no constitutional grounds to make that case. If the nation wanted to legalize abortion, it should have been left up to Congress, to the legislators. That was sort of his originalist argument. This was a good conservative solution to the Supreme Court because Bork thought that people on the Supreme Court happened to be liberal elitists who disdained American traditions. And so his idea of originalism was Americanism. He applied these ideas to several rulings he made in the 1980s when he was on the U.S. Circuit Court as a judge. One such case in 1984 involved an enlisted sailor who sued that his right to privacy was violated when he was discharged from the Navy for homosexual conduct. Bork wrote the majority opinion that rejected the premise of that lawsuit. He maintained that judges were not obligated to take Supreme Court decisions that gave people more rights as precedents. In particular, Bork rejected the right to privacy, which was a precedent set by the 1965 Supreme Court case Griswold versus Connecticut, which invalidated laws that restricted the sale of contraceptive on the grounds of a right to privacy. More to the point of those who opposed Bork's nomination to the Supreme Court, by rejecting the privacy precedent of the Supreme Court, Bork was rejecting the legal grounds upon which Roe v. Wade was decided. The Supreme Court ruled in Roe v. Wade in 1973 that a woman had a right to an abortion because she had a right to privacy, so there was precedent there. If Bork rejects the sort of right to privacy as precedent, he can then object to Roe v. Wade, and Bork's nomination did in fact become a referendum on abortion. Indeed, Bork had described Roe v. Wade as a classic instance of the sort of judicial activism, the judicial overreach that he hated so much. Powerful liberal Democrats in the Senate lined up to sink his nomination. The Democrats had a majority in the Senate, and so Bork was not going to be approved to be in the Supreme Court, confirmed, unless he convinced some Democrats to side with him. The leader leading the charge in this was Joseph Biden, looking a little bit younger there, who at the time he had sort of designs on the Democratic presidential nomination for 1988. I guess he's had designs on that for a very long time. Biden was chair at the time of the powerful Judiciary Committee in the Senate. So in this role, he led the charge against Bork by compiling an unfavorable assessment of Bork's views that became known as the Biden Report. And here he's holding up this thick binder that was the Biden Report. Biden was joined by another powerful liberal senator, Ted Kennedy, who gave a speech on the day Reagan nominated Bork that stands as one of the more quintessential instances of culture wars rhetoric. In his speech, you can sense this divide between the pre-60s and post-60s America. And it's a little bit of a long quote, but worthwhile. I can't really do the Boston accent, so just bear with me. Robert Bork's America is a land in which women would be forced into back alley abortions, blacks would sit at segregated lunch counters, rogue police could break down citizens' doors in midnight raids, school children could not be taught about evolution, writers and artists could be censored at the whim of government, and the doors of the federal courts could be shut on the fingers of millions of citizens for whom the judiciary is often the only protector of individual rights that are at the heart of our democracy. America is a better and freer nation than Robert Bork thinks. Yet in the current delicate balance of the Supreme Court, his rigid ideology will tip the scales of justice against the kind of country America is and ought to be. It's pretty harsh, it's pretty extreme rhetoric there. It's typical culture wars rhetoric. So the Senate Judiciary Committee rejected Bork's nomination by a 9-5 vote, down party lines, which was followed by a 58-42 vote against him by the entire Senate. After this, the verb to Bork entered the American political lexicon as a verb to describe partisan efforts to squash judicial and political appointments. And you heard this tossed around when Clarence Thomas was nominated a few years later. Shortly after the disappointment of his failed Supreme Court confirmation hearings, Bork quit the bench and joined the American Enterprise Institute as a resident scholar. This gave him an audience willing to listen to him retell the story of his losing battle against American liberalism. and he sort of had a funny thing to say about this. I can offer you a unique perspective. Who wouldn't like George Armstrong Custer's version of events at the Little Bighorn? So he's seen himself as General Custer in the Culture Wars. Bork's most complete explanation of American liberalism, his critique of it, is found in a book that he wrote in 1966 called Slouching Towards Gomorrah, Modern Liberalism and American Decline. This book was sort of an all-encompassing explanation of everything that was wrong with America, blaming it all on liberalism, and it sort of demonstrates conservative anxieties about feminism especially, but other movements of the 60s that had obliterated American norms. He believed that too many Americans had a sort of relativistic theory that reality is socially constructed. Maybe you've heard this in some of your classes before. He believed that this had been a product of these 60s liberation movements that were trying to replace traditional standards with a more countercultural philosophy that was suggested by the slogan that was common during the 1960s, "If it feels good, do it." These were hardly the rules that everybody could live by, Bork thought, particularly when they pertained to traditional gender roles, particularly when it pertained to things like abortion and human life. In arguing that the vast majority of women who sought abortions did so as a matter of convenience, because it felt good, this is Bork's argument, Bork contended that abortion was, quote, a way for women to escape the idea that biology is destiny, and to escape the tyranny of the family role. So what Bork's doing here is he's explaining feminism as a threat to civilization. By challenging our sort of deeply ingrained expectations that women should prioritize their roles as wives and mothers, feminists had degraded the sanctity of human life. Feminists seemingly ranked the needs of women over the right of an embryo to live. This is something, it should be noted, that most Americans, even religious Americans, aside from Catholics, had done throughout the 20th century up until Roe v. Wade. So an inaccurate sort of understanding of history notwithstanding, Bork believed that such a view had redefined human life in dangerous fashion. He maintained that abortion deepens and legitimates the nihilism, or this civilizational death drive that is spreading in our culture and finds killing for convenience acceptable. So what he's doing here is he's equating feminism and modern American liberalism with Nazism. And he's pretty explicit about that connection. Nazism, for people like Bork, was serving as an all-encompassing analogy for this death drive nihilism, or this disregard for human life. So it's the opposite of Americanism. For Bork, abortion is un-American, and this is sort of part of his larger argument. Of course, before we celebrate Bork as a devout American patriot, it should also be noted that he made the argument, it's a bit of a heresy, that individual freedoms enshrined in the Declaration of Independence were dangerous because they set into motion a society dedicated to permanent cultural revolution. So in this same book, he's making a case against the Declaration of Independence. This is a little bit interesting, right? How does one set limits on the proposition that all men are created equal against the assumptions of those who signed the Declaration, the Founding Fathers? All men eventually came to include non-property holders, former slaves, blacks and other racial minorities, immigrants from strange lands, Catholics, Jews, and other non-Christians, atheists, women, gays, lesbians, the disabled, the list goes on and on. Viewed in this way, the 60s liberation movements, feminism, black power, civil rights, gay liberation, they sort of made concrete this ethos, this philosophy that dates to the nation's founding and the Declaration of Independence. But as I show in the book, the history of the culture wars shows that no matter how foundational such an ethos is to America, liberation, the the liberation, such as we saw in the 60s, is met with fierce resistance. When new people lay claim to the nation, when new people have different ideas about the nation, the national culture has and will fracture. It really can't be otherwise. That's sort of like the perennial history of American cultural conflict. And so I would expect such battles to continue to rage on. So thank you very much, and I would love questions.
Questions?
And as a teacher, I love awkward silence, so we can sit here for a while.
I got a question.
Yes.
Maybe I'll ask a question while students are thinking. So I appreciate the way that you were trying to say both that the 60s marked this sort of shift, and yet that the seeds of it extend earlier. So my question would be, do you think that you could see, as you talked, it just seemed to me that the sort of antinomian controversies during the Puritan period maybe even contained some of the seeds where there's these, on the one hand, the sort of originalist, people who want to interpret the Bible this way, and there's people who say, look, you're rejecting the Church of England, you're rejecting authority, let's take that further. And so maybe what you concluded with, that these tensions are deeply embedded in American culture. I guess I'm just asking if you see this in the Puritan move also.
I think so. I mean, if you think about the concept of truth and stability, cultural stability, these debates go back to, I don't know, ancient Greece.
Right.
You know, they've always sort of been there. So what I'm showing is, yes, those were always there, but they didn't become sort of widespread fears across the culture until the 60s because people didn't really think about, they weren't concerned with what were mostly sort of debates by intellectuals until these political movements made it seem like the culture itself had changed irrevocably. And so I think that's where, this is kind of like an insider baseball thing. A lot of historians have recently argued that the 60s aren't that new, nothing was that new. And my argument is, well, these ideas were there, but most Americans weren't aware of these cultural sort of earthquakes until the 60s. And that's why we get a culture wars in the 70s and 80s and 90s, and why we don't see this same type of cultural conflict throughout the 20th century until the late 20th century. If that answers your question. Yes.
In your research, did you find any evidence of the moral compass or religious faction and factors in America and how that challenged or went along with or any of that for the culture war?
Well, yes. So I mentioned James Davison Hunter, whose 1991 book. He's a sociologist of religion, a great scholar, University of Virginia. This book he wrote in 1991 sort of like set the parameters of how we understand the culture wars. And in this book, he argues that perhaps for the first time in American history, people were organizing with people from other religious faiths because they were, especially conservatives, because they were concerned less about, like if you're evangelical, all of a sudden in the 1980s and 90s, or by the 70s even, you're less concerned with Catholics than you are concerned with atheists or secularists or the sort of social movements that arose from the 1960s. And so that's a really important point that I think is valid. What you probably heard from me today was less of a focus on that religious aspect, because I would say that the terms of the debate were not always very religious. That said, evangelicals were especially evangelical Christians and conservative Catholics were extremely involved in a lot of these culture wars, abortion being a key issue, but also I think the most important issue for many of them was the sort of church-state, the redefinition of church-state. And so something like the 1962 Engel versus Vital Supreme Court case, which ruled that prayer in schools was unconstitutional, became a sort of rallying point. And they're increasingly thinking of public schools as these sort of engines of government, secularization, secular humanism. And so the religious issues really plays out in that way. So it's extremely important, of course. And I think, you see this perfect storm. On the one hand, America is becoming more and more secular. The public space is becoming secular, but a growing number of Americans are less defined by religious faith as we move from the 60s forward to today. But on the other hand, those who are religious are becoming much more sort of political about their religion, probably in response to this secularization. Yes?
I guess off of that, do you think that once the old geezers in the House and the Senate die off and the power gets to the people that are younger, I guess, that have gone through all of these culture wars, that the wars will then become peace talks and compromises, and it will be less I'm right kind of thing, and more of a let's all be right in this peaceful way kind of, I don't know. You know what I'm asking?
Yeah, that's a nice vision, but no. Some of, for example, in the new House, some of the most conservative are some of the youngest members. So, no, I think they're less defined by sort of issues of the 70s, but I don't think that there's any chance for a decrease in polarization anytime soon. So, the intense polarization you see in Washington right now is going to continue. For a long time, I would imagine. You never know. I'm not a soothsayer or a prophet. So. Well, as students, let me ask you this. Have you heard of the culture wars? Do you think much about it? What do you think about when you hear culture wars?
This is the point where you talk.
Well, now that I'm informed, I think about feminist, black power, civil rights, and the activists. But I wouldn't have ever been able to say that 2 hours ago.
Yeah. A lot of people who haven't sort of studied historically, who are otherwise knowledgeable, often tend to think of it strictly in terms of issues like abortion, which is kind of a lightning rod throughout much of the 80s and 90s. But my argument is it's a much larger thing that sort of shaped the history of the 80s and 90s. I don't know whether it still does or not. There's still some sort of culture wars debates going on. Have you paid any attention to the many conservative states are trying to get rid of AP U.S. history? Have you seen this in the news? So these types of debates are still with us. Hasn't happened in Michigan as far as I know. Other questions? Yes.
Do you have any suggestions about where we should hang our hat?
In the culture wars?
Yeah.
Just say no.
Well, I wouldn't call myself a culture warrior. In fact, I decided to write a book on this topic because I was mostly just fascinated by it. I don't really consider myself a partisan, but I have views, yeah. I'm kind of open to the sort of more secular or pluralistic, that's a good way of putting it, more pluralistic America than 1950s America had to offer. But choose your own sides. Yes?
Yeah. You made a contrast between your argument and Thomas Frank in the first. I think there are 2 points. First is Thomas Frank is saying that it's not important, and you said it's important. Yeah. I mean, simple comparison. Yeah. Second point is Thomas Frank is actually talking about the overall impact of the culture war. So he said, as far as I understand, his point is is actually something, I mean, dragging people's attention away from the real issue, which is like foreign policy or economic policy, to something unimportant or like something, I mean, hypothetical or like something like unimportant. So it is, I mean, from his perspective, it's like the overall effect of culture war is actually kind of conservative turn in the U.S. politics, or like, again, as you mentioned, like people voting against their own class interest. Right? So, what do you think about what is your view about like the overall effect? I mean, you believe that it is important, but what was the overall consequence of the culture war in U.S. politics or society?
That's a good question. So, I think that I don't think it has the same effect necessarily that Thomas Frank thinks it does. So his argument is that a lot of religious conservatives should be voting for like liberal Democrats on economic issues, but instead are voting for conservative Republicans who then are hurting them economically. And so he considers it a big distraction. But I don't know, you know, one thing that has happened is that both parties on economic issues from the 70s to the 90s sort of came together. There wasn't this great distinction between the two parties. You see this best in the presidency of Bill Clinton, whose economic policies were more conservative than, say, Richard Nixon's or Gerald Ford's. And so, maybe not Ford, but definitely Richard Nixon's. And so, you know, I think to say that people were irrational about their political choices sort of diminishes the fact that they didn't really have political choices when it came to economics, and so they were going to, but they had this sort of existential commitment to these questions of identity wrapped up in the nation, and so that's why I think Frank is a little bit too dismissive. Your question, did the culture wars, I don't think they made the U.S. more or less conservative. I think they sort of represent how divided the U.S. was and still is. I wouldn't blame the culture wars for a much more conservative political system now than we had in 2000. I would put other factors into that. But that's a good question, a tough question, so thank you. Anyone else? Did you get enough for your extra credit papers?
Could you just send us the book?
You can buy it.
It's not expensive, very easy.
$20. Or if you have a Kindle, it's like 11. Well, thank you for coming out. I enjoyed it.